would consider myself a woman in tandem to her faith community for many years. When I understood as a middle school, junior high girl, sitting on the second row of my church and noticing that every deacon sitting on the front row in front of me was a man, I turned to my mother and said, there are so many wonderful women. Why aren't they on the first row? And my mother handed me an index card, which is what she did to keep the 5 children quiet. And she said, why don't you write the names of all the women in this church you would like to see on the front row? Wow. Understanding that I was present, committed, I was loved in that congregation, but also I was in tandem with it. I wasn't really included in the leadership or the potential of being in the leadership. And so I understood myself as a committed but tandem participant in my faith community. I serve right now as the executive coordinator of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. So we call ourselves a network. We are not a denomination in the traditional sense. We don't ordain people. We don't own their buildings. And this whole issue of ownership, a very big issue for denominational life. This idea that we own someone's ordination, or we own their buildings, or we own their things. So we don't have ownership. We don't even own our own building. But we have 1,800 churches that participate with us. And we broke away from the Southern Baptist Convention 25 years ago over primarily the interpretation of Scripture and women in ministry. And that became a place, not to say, sadly, that meant there were equal pulpits for women. Right. But there was the conviction of equality in ministry and ordination. And this is the sad story of all denominations, I think, is that in the denominational framework, even those that are progressive denominations, a lot of times, there's not actually the infrastructure to support women in the way in which they need to be supported. And I'll go back to Joanne's wonderful presentation last night about HTI. Intentionality and infrastructure have to come beyond a statement of equality or even ordination, you have to put these things first. They can't just be said and checked off, which is how it tends to be. And I was hired by the Baptist Convention of Texas, which is 5,300 churches. If it were its own denomination, it would be the 9th largest religious organization in the world.
What organization was that again?
The Baptist General Convention of Texas. I was hired by them as their lobbyist and did 12 issue areas for justice and peace, including prison reform, children's foster care, all kinds of ministries. I was over all our I was a do-gooder lobbyist. And environmental issues, church-state issues. But took those lobby skills that I had, and again, I was a woman in tandem with my faith. Bringing something as weird as lobbying and advocacy into Baptist life. Just pause a minute, think about that intersection. And what I learned from that was how you change a church and how you move a church community toward something that calls and speaks of justice is not from here with this. No. Which is our tendency. When we're passionate, we want to stand up and call people to it and, kind of shape them into it, right? That has that righteousness can also be self-righteousness pretty quickly. And I learned that was my instinct, but not the right toolkit. that really moving congregations towards justice was finding where that congregation was already engaged. To take this meager church, this meager ministry, the food pantry that's done in the most paternalistic of ways. But those people have a heart for that ministry. And began to help them see the stories of the people that were there every week.
That's right.
Why were they coming back? What was the story of the family behind? And that to get out of the posture of giving to the posture of listening. And these conservative, white Baptist churches in Texas began to advocate at the state capitol on behalf of the people they were ministering to. And they began to come in mass. They spoke on behalf of our refugee and immigrant population in Texas. They stood up against the Republican legislature in Texas and stood up for sanctuary cities, Baptists in Texas.
Wow. Wow. There is a God, right?
And I just have to give a shout out again to Joanne and HTI, because within our Baptist construct in Texas was the Christian Latino Leadership Institute out of the Baptist University of America. One of Joanne's students, Nora Lozano, started that program. And these women come together for 3 years in a row, and there's no place for them to serve in their churches as pastors. Year 2, so their calling is the first summer. The second summer, how do you start your own nonprofit ministry, your own 501c3? Who do you get in the community? And they bring in all the leadership of Latino leadership from the hospital. All of these women that come together to support these women in ministry in their nascent ministries that begin as separate 501c3s. And then networking our churches to that. So these issues of advocacy and ministry. And this is how to see denominational work. This is what it means to build a network of people speaking from their calling and empowering that and creating the governance structures, the advocacy structures, and the funding to make this happen. And calling people out of it, not pressing them into some place they don't feel comfortable in. Denominational structures themselves do not afford empowerment. We have to build living systems within the structure of denominations and religious groups that forge empowerment. We have to create new structures that are intentionally for empowerment.
Yeah.
But that we build what we call action teams in churches. So on Sunday morning, a person can get up and they have a minute for mission. And they say, I have a heart for this public school 16 blocks from our church. I want to help this school. Is there anyone else in the congregation that would join with me in that ministry? Meet me after worship. Let's have a cup of coffee. If 5 people show up, you got a ministry. But that becomes an action team. And they have a purpose, and they have a drive, and they have a common ministry. And there's no rotation of committee members or, all that. It's just an action team that can get things done. So here's my alternative to that. Bless the few who do. Just bless the few who do. And that's what these action teams become. They become the few people who do in a congregation. And they're intentionally outside of the structure in order to give them life. We set aside budget money every year. It's because we're going to give it to the action teams that come up. To set up an organization, we have one, BWIM, Baptist Women in Ministry, which sounded very odd when it started 25 years ago. There were not, the first ordained Baptist woman that I knew was a Peter. Somebody in my generation realized that in 1971, as I was looking to graduate college, I couldn't even get a credit card or a bank account without the signature of my husband or my father.
Wow.
Ooh.
That's my life.
Yikes.
That's my lifetime. So I mean, this idea of women in ministry and ordination was something that the first ordained Baptist woman I heard preach was a Peter. And what a joy that was. And I think that this is where God is such a great recycler. He just doesn't waste anything. Right?
That's right.
And so, I mean, I wouldn't be the head of our denomination today if I'd been on that theological path. I wouldn't have the skill set to run this large organization. But because I've been a woman in tandem to it, I've been able to come in at the right time and be a woman in leadership and bring those gifts. And so, number one, the cultivation of lay women to clergy women. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Go out and develop lay women in tandem to clergy women. Every person in the HTI, every woman needs a lay woman who's also her supporter, cheerleader, advocate, because the skills are just they're traded. It's a permeable boundary with women, and it's beautiful. So so in Baptist Life, we started Baptist Women in Ministry, and we began to create an organization for women who are ordained, and we didn't muddy it up with just letting anybody in. And so BWIM became this engine and this space, and yes, in some ways, kind of a guilt-inducing presence, in a healthy way, but to say, this is what a preacher looks like. Now, how do you get that into the lay? It's the lay people that have to understand, appreciate, and accept this. And so we also began this whole idea, sort of like home away for clergy, So that this, in February, is the Martha Stearns Marshall Month, where we invite women to be in pulpits all over the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And it's an initiative in every state and region. Women will be in the pulpit, women will be in the pulpit, women will be in the pulpit. Again, these things that we want to see them happen, we have to institutionalize them. But you have to normalize the expectation and suggest, I know the perfect woman. Or, the same thing with student.go. So the pipeline, let's talk about the pipeline. Camps, college, seminary, women's groups, peer learning groups. We expanded our relationship to seminaries. You know what? We don't own a seminary. We started 6 seminaries on Baptist college campuses, which include Truett Seminary at Baylor, Gardner-Webb, and several different other colleges. But then we also affiliated with Baptist houses of study at Duke, at Emory, at a Lutheran seminary in Alabama, and different. So now we have a relationship with 14 seminaries. Okay, so we have a consortium of 14 seminaries that we work with. So we give scholarships in all of those seminaries. We have CBF days. We go and build identity with our students there and bring a message of women in ministry. And we do placement and referral for students in those 14 seminaries. And I'm clear about that. I'm passionate about it. I can tell stories all day about any one of those 3 areas of what matters in those areas. And speaking into, knowing clearly, speaking passionately and unashamedly, you have the best mission of all. If you haven't read Henry Nouwen's little book, The Spirituality of Fundraising, it's the best 90 pages that'll be but this idea that people with resources need meaningful places to put their money.
Those 3 things, which one do you think which one got the most of the $12 million? Was there one of those 3?
It's different. It's just different with different people, different donors connect to different.
Did it sort of split $4 million each? $4 million for each of those?
It really split about 6 to global.